The county auction yard had begun emptying by the time Walter Hayes reached the last row. Most buyers had already loaded the machines worth discussing: tractors with decent tires, clean oil, and engines that started without smoke had sold early. Hay wagons, seed drills, and balers followed. By late afternoon, only the equipment no one trusted remained near the back fence. 14 tractors stood together in the weeds. None of them ran. Their paint had faded into dull patches of red, green, and blue. Several were missing wheels. One had no hood. Another leaned toward the ground where a front axle had collapsed. Rust had eaten through exhaust pipes and fenders. Rainwater had collected inside cracked seats, and vines climbed through open engine compartments. To the crowd, they were no longer machines. They were scrap waiting to be weighed. Walter stopped in front of the first tractor. A farmer beside him laughed. "You planning to farm with that?" Walter did not answer. He stepped onto the axle, leaned over the damaged hood, and wiped grease from the engine block. Beneath the dirt, a casting number appeared. He read it twice. Then he moved to the next machine. Walter was 67, with stiff fingers and shoulders worn down by 4 decades of lifting transmissions, pulling engines, and working beneath machines heavier than anything a man should trust above his chest. He no longer moved quickly, but he moved with purpose. He ignored the missing seats. He ignored the flat tires. He ignored the cracked headlights and weeds. Instead, he searched for serial plates, hydraulic pump housings, gearbox codes, axle shapes, and bolt patterns. He crouched beside one tractor and traced the edge of a rear housing with his thumb. On another, he checked the number of bolts around a transmission cover. A younger mechanic watched him. "None of those engines will turn," the man said. Walter nodded. "I know. Then what are you looking for?" Walter stood and looked across the row. "Everything that didn't fail." The mechanic frowned. Walter had learned long ago that tractors rarely died all at once. An engine could seize while the rear axle remained strong. A broken frame could still hold a usable hydraulic pump. A machine abandoned because of one damaged gear might contain a starter, steering box, control valve, differential, and dozens of smaller components no manufacturer produced anymore. The dealership searched for parts by official model number. Walter searched by design. He knew that 2 tractors sold under different names could share the same pump. He knew a housing from one production year might fit another if the correct spacer was retained. He knew which manufacturers changed part numbers without changing the metal beneath them. Most of that knowledge lived in old notebooks stacked inside his repair shop. Some of it lived only in his memory. The auctioneer approached. "You interested in one?" Walter looked at the entire row again. "How much for the lot?" The auctioneer smiled, assuming he was joking. "All 14? Walter nodded. Word spread quickly. People stopped loading trailers. Several farmers walked closer. Someone near the gate said Walter had finally lost his mind. Another estimated that hauling the tractors would cost more than the metal was worth. The bidding lasted less than a minute. No one challenged him. Walter bought all 14 for slightly more than scrap price. The amount was still dangerous. It consumed nearly every dollar he had saved since reducing the hours at his repair shop 2 years earlier. The roof leaked. The power bill was late. He had no guaranteed customers and no clear idea how much transportation would cost. The auctioneer handed him the receipt. "You restoring them?" "No." "Then what are you going to do?" Walter folded the paper and placed it in his shirt pocket. "Take them apart." The laughter returned. Walter walked back to the faded red tractor at the end of the row. He crouched beside its rear axle and scraped away another layer of rust. The casting number underneath matched one he had written in a notebook 19 years earlier. That housing fit 6 tractor models. 3 were still working on farms within 30 miles. Walter rested one hand against the cold metal. Everyone else saw 14 tractors that would never run again. Walter saw the first pieces of machines that still could. Walter had not hauled a single tractor home before the story reached town. By the time he stopped at Miller's Diner for coffee, 3 men at the counter were already discussing the auction. 14. One of them said, "Not one. 14. Another shook his head. Hayes must have spent his retirement on rust. Walter entered without reacting. He ordered black coffee and took the booth nearest the window. The room quieted for less than a second. Then Dale Mercer turned on his stool. Dale owned the largest equipment dealership in the county. His showroom stood beside the highway, lined with polished tractors, financing banners, and machines that cost more than most houses in town. He had known Walter for years and had never understood why farmers still trusted a small repair shop with an uneven floor and hand-painted sign. "I heard you bought yourself a fleet," Dale said. Walter lifted his cup. "A fleet usually moves." A few men laughed. Dale smiled. "So what would you call 14 dead tractors? Inventory?" That answer earned more laughter than the first. Walter finished his coffee and left. His son was waiting at the shop when he returned. Daniel stood beside the office desk, holding the auction receipt. He was 36. Broad-shouldered like Walter had been at the same age, but quicker in everything: his speech, his temper, and his belief that problems should be solved immediately. "You spent nearly all of it," Daniel said. Walter removed his jacket. "Not all. Enough. The parts are worth more. If they're usable, they are. You haven't opened a single gearbox." Walter looked toward the roof, where rainwater had left dark stains across the ceiling. Daniel followed his eyes. "The roofing estimate is still unpaid," he said. "The electric company called again, and now we have to move 14 tractors from the auction yard." "I know. Do you know what that costs?" Walter did. The first hauling company refused the job because several machines had locked wheels. The second offered a price that would consume nearly half of Walter's remaining cash. A local farmer named Roy Tanner finally agreed to help with his lowboy trailer, but only if Walter covered fuel and assisted with loading. The first tractor took 2 hours. Its rear wheels would not turn. One front wheel was missing, forcing them to raise the frame with a jack and slide a timber beneath the axle. The winch cable strained as the tractor scraped onto the trailer. At the shop, they discovered the yard was too soft near the back fence. The lowboy sank to its hubs. Daniel spent an hour placing boards beneath the tires while Walter worked the controls. By sunset, they had moved one tractor 12 miles. 13 remained. Over the next 4 days, the shop yard filled with rusted machines. People slowed their trucks to stare. Children counted the tractors from the roadside. Someone hung a cardboard sign on the fence during the night. "Walter's retirement farm." Daniel tore it down before his father arrived. Walter found the string still tied to the post. "You didn't have to remove it," he said. "It wasn't funny." "It was a little funny." Daniel stared at him. Walter walked toward the faded red tractor and opened the toolbox mounted beside its seat. Inside he found 3 rusted wrenches, a broken chain, and a mouse nest. Nothing valuable. He moved to the hydraulic housing and removed the inspection cover. The oil inside was dark, but there were no metal fragments on the drain plug. He rotated the exposed shaft by hand. It moved smoothly. Daniel crouched beside him. "That proves nothing. It proves the shaft isn't seized." Walter continued checking. On tractor number 4, the engine was ruined, but the steering box had little play. Number 6 had a cracked transmission case, yet its hydraulic control valve remained protected beneath an intact cover. Number 9 had burned wiring, but the rear differential teeth looked clean. Walter marked each discovery in chalk. S for salvageable, T for test, X for reject. By the end of the week, white symbols covered the tractors. Daniel studied them from the shop doorway. "How long before any of this makes money?" Walter did not answer immediately. He had spent more on hauling than expected. The power bill remained unpaid. Rain had begun dripping through the roof into a metal bucket beside the workbench. From the office, the telephone rang. Daniel picked it up. A farmer, 12 miles south, had lost hydraulic pressure in an older tractor. The dealership said the pump assembly was discontinued. Daniel covered the receiver. He wants to know if we can help. Walter looked across the 14 machines. For the first time since the auction, no one was laughing. Ask him for the model number, he said. The caller's name was Earl Dawson. His tractor had lost hydraulic pressure while lifting a loaded hay spear. The arms had dropped without warning, leaving a round bale resting against the ground and the machine useless in the middle of his feeding season. The dealer says the pump assembly is discontinued, Daniel said after hanging up. They offered to apply the repair estimate toward a newer tractor. Walter wrote the model number on a scrap of cardboard. Then he walked outside. He stopped beside tractor number 6. Its engine had thrown a connecting rod through the block. The hood was bent. The wiring harness had burned, and one rear tire had split open. No reasonable person would restore it. Walter had never intended to. He removed the side panel and cleaned the identification plate on the hydraulic pump. The official number did not match Earl's machine. Daniel checked the catalog. Wrong pump. Walter measured the mounting flange. Same 4-bolt pattern. The shaft length is different. But how much? Daniel used the caliper. 3/16. Walter opened an old notebook from the shop office. Its pages were stained with oil and filled with sketches, measurements, and part numbers recorded over 4 decades. He found an entry from 17 years earlier. The pump on tractor number 6 had been sold under a different brand, but the internal body, pressure rating, and gear set were identical to Earl's. Only the drive coupling and rear cover differed. Daniel read the notes twice. So we transfer the coupling? If the shaft and bearings pass inspection. That afternoon, Earl arrived in a pickup carrying his damaged pump in a feed sack. Walter placed both units on the bench. Earl's pump had deep scoring inside the housing. The gears had worn enough to let oil escape around them instead of building pressure. Replacing seals would do nothing. The salvage pump looked better. But Walter did not trust appearances. He disassembled it completely. The front bearing turned smoothly. The gear teeth showed no pitting. The housing had light wear but no deep grooves. Walter measured the gear clearance with a feeler gauge, then checked the shaft for runout. Daniel watched the dial indicator. 0.002. Acceptable. They cleaned the parts, installed new seals, and transferred Earl's original coupling. The rear cover required a thinner gasket to maintain proper end clearance. Earl stood near the door. How soon can you put it on? Walter continued measuring. When it passes. It looks good. Looking good doesn't lift hay. They mounted the rebuilt pump on Walter's test stand. The first test was performed with cold oil. Pressure rose steadily. The second test used heated oil to reveal internal leakage. At operating temperature, the pressure dropped slightly, but remained within specification. Walter held the pump at working pressure for 10 minutes. No unusual noise. No leaking seals. No overheating around the front bearing. Only then did he shut down the test stand. It can go on the tractor. Earl released a breath he had been holding. The repair cost less than 1 monthly payment on the newer machine the dealership had suggested. Before leaving, Earl looked through the open shop doors at the 14 rusted tractors. You really going to rebuild all those? No. What are you doing with them? Walter pointed toward the numbered chalk marks, separating what failed from what didn't. Over the next 2 days, Daniel helped him create a proper inventory. They removed starters, hydraulic valves, steering boxes, gears, shafts, hoops, and control levers. Every component received a tag showing its source tractor, casting number, measurements, and condition. Walter rejected more parts than Daniel expected. A clean gear with 1 chipped tooth went into the scrap bin. A hydraulic housing with an invisible crack revealed by dye testing was marked with red paint. A starter that spun freely failed under load and was discarded. By Friday, the yard looked worse than before. 3 tractors had no hoods. 2 stood without rear axles. Parts covered every available bench. But the shelves inside the shop were beginning to fill with tested components that no warehouse nearby carried. Daniel picked up a steering valve and read its new label. Compatible with 5 models. Most people would have searched by tractor number, he said. That's why most people couldn't find it. The telephone rang again. This time, Earl was not calling about a problem. His tractor had lifted 30 bales without losing pressure. He had given Walter's number to 2 other farmers. Daniel looked toward the road. A truck had already turned into the driveway. The town still saw 14 ruined tractors, but the first usable pieces were beginning to leave. The truck belonged to Harold Pike, a cattle farmer from the east side of the county. He stepped out carrying a hydraulic control valve wrapped in an old towel. Earl Dawson said you fixed his pump. Walter took the valve and placed it on the bench. What happened? The loader rises, but it won't hold. Drops as soon as I let go of the lever. Daniel removed the towel. The valve body was stained with oil. One port had been plugged with a bolt that did not belong there. The control lever moved too easily. Harold pointed through the shop door toward the stripped tractors. Earl said you might have one of these. Maybe? Walter said. Harold looked relieved. How soon can you swap it? Walter did not answer. He connected the valve to the test stand and increased pressure slowly. Oil began leaking internally before the gauge reached half the working range. The spool, or the bore, is worn, Daniel said. Walter nodded. He removed the control spool and held it beneath the inspection lamp. A dark groove circled the polished surface. That's where the pressure escapes, he said. Harold leaned closer. Can you repair it? Not safely enough for a loaded bucket. The relief vanished from Harold's face. I've got cattle pens to clean before tomorrow. Walter walked outside. He checked tractor number 4 first. Its valve looked similar, but the outlet ports were smaller. Number 7 had the correct port size, yet the mounting bracket faced the wrong direction. On number 11, the control lever was missing, but the valve body remained sealed beneath a steel cover. Walter scraped the identification plate clean. The part number was different. Daniel opened the catalog. Doesn't list Harold's model. Walter measured the bore, port spacing, relief valve diameter, and spool travel. Then he compared those measurements with Harold's damaged unit. Same body, he said. The lever arrangement is different, Daniel replied. Levers can be transferred. They carried the valve inside and disassembled it. Water had entered through one open fitting. The upper passage contained surface rust. Walter cleaned it with a nylon brush, then inspected the bore for pitting. Near the center, Daniel noticed a dark line. Crack? Walter applied penetrant dye and waited. The line did not spread. Machining mark. They replaced the seals, transferred Harold's lever assembly, and installed a new relief spring. The old spring had weakened enough to open below specification. Harold checked the wall clock. Can we try it now? Walter pointed to the test stand. Cold first. The rebuilt valve held pressure. Walter moved the lever through every position, checking the return flow and listening for chatter. Then he heated the oil to operating temperature and repeated the test. At higher temperature, a thin film of oil appeared around one fitting. Daniel reached for a wrench. Walter stopped him. Remove it. It only needs tightening, or the threads are stretched. They removed the fitting. 2 threads had begun to deform. Walter replaced it instead of forcing it deeper. The second test showed no leak. By late afternoon, they installed the valve on Harold's tractor. He raised the loader, held a heavy bale above the ground, and shut off the engine. The loader arms remained still. Harold waited 30 seconds. Then a full minute. They haven't held like that in 2 years. Walter checked the valve temperature and inspected every connection again. You need new hoses before winter, he said. The outer rubber is cracking. Harold looked at the lifted bale. How much? Walter named the price. Harold frowned. That's all? That's the repair. The dealer wanted nearly 5 times that for a conversion kit. Walter wiped his hands. I didn't install a conversion kit. Harold paid, then added 2 folded bills to the bench. Walter pushed them back. No. For getting it done today. No. Harold picked up the money reluctantly. At the door, he looked across the yard. I laughed when I heard you bought those tractors. Walter said nothing. I thought you had lost your sense. That makes 2 of us. Daniel said. Harold smiled. But Walter did not. The repair had worked. That did not mean every part in the yard was valuable. It did not erase the unpaid bills or the cost of moving the machines. It only proved that one correct component, properly tested, could matter more than an entire tractor that no longer ran. The next morning, Harold returned. This time, nothing was broken. A second pickup followed him into the yard. Then a third. Harold stepped out and pointed toward Walter's shop. I told them not to ask whether he has the right model. He said, ask whether he has the right part. By the following Monday, Walter's shelves held enough clean parts to make the shop look prosperous. It was an illusion. Most of the components still carried yellow tags marked Test Required. Only a small number had passed inspection, and those were leaving almost as quickly as Daniel could label them. Then Samuel Reed arrived with a damaged transmission gear. His tractor had begun jumping out of second gear while pulling a grain wagon. The dealership could order a replacement, but delivery would take 5 weeks. Harvest was less than a month away. Walter compared Samuel's gear with one removed from tractor number 9. The tooth count matched. The shaft diameter matched. Even the width and pressure angle were identical. Daniel cleaned the salvage gear and placed it beneath the inspection lamp. It looks almost new. Walter rotated it slowly. The polished tooth surfaces showed normal wear. There were no chips, no discoloration from heat, and no visible cracks around the hub. Samuel stood at the workbench. So it'll work? Walter hesitated. The shop's power bill was overdue. The roof repair company had called twice. Samuel's payment would cover both. It should, Walter said. They rebuilt the transmission that afternoon. Walter replaced the bearings, checked shaft end play, and inspected the shift collar. Daniel installed the salvage gear and filled the case with fresh oil. On the floor test, every gear engaged smoothly. No grinding, no unusual vibration. Samuel paid and drove the tractor home. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third morning, Walter heard a truck enter the yard before the shop opened. Samuel stepped out holding the broken gear. It had split through the hub. One half remained attached to the shaft. The other had fallen into the transmission case and damaged 2 neighboring gears. Walter stared at the fracture. The break followed a dark line buried beneath the surface. Daniel picked up the second piece. We couldn't have seen that. Walter said nothing. Samuel's voice remained controlled, but his hand shook. I was coming down the north hill with a loaded wagon. The transmission locked. Anyone hurt? Walter asked. No. I got it stopped. Walter looked at the damaged metal again. The gear had appeared clean because the crack was internal. Years of repeated load had weakened the hub, and the final installation had placed it back under stress. Walter opened the cash drawer. I'm refunding the repair. Samuel shook his head. The bearings are still new. I'm refunding all of it. Walter also paid for the replacement gears, the oil, and the transportation needed to bring the tractor back. The cost consumed almost everything the previous week's repairs had earned. Daniel waited until Samuel left. You didn't cause that crack. I installed the gear. You checked it? I looked at it. There was no way to know. Walter carried the broken pieces to the bench. There was a way. We didn't use it. That afternoon, he stopped all sales. Daniel protested. We have customers waiting. They can wait. Walter ordered magnetic particle testing equipment he could barely afford. For non-magnetic housings, he bought penetrant dye. He built a fixture to apply load to gears and shafts before installation. Then he reviewed every part already on the shelves. The results were worse than Daniel expected. A steering arm that looked perfect revealed a crack near the mounting hole. 2 gears failed under load. A hydraulic housing leaked through a porous casting once the oil became hot. Walter marked each one with red paint and threw it into the scrap bin. By sunset, nearly half the shelves were empty. Daniel held up another rejected gear. At this rate, we won't have enough parts left to make any money. Walter wrote the failure in his ledger. Then we won't make money from bad parts. Outside, rain began falling through the damaged roof. A drop struck the open page. Walter moved the ledger aside and placed a bucket beneath the leak. The 14 tractors still contained value, but Walter now understood that rust was not the greatest danger. The greatest danger was a part that looked trustworthy. Harvest began 6 days earlier than expected. The summer had been dry, and the grain ripened fast. By the first Monday in September, combines were already cutting the southern fields, while tractors pulled wagons from sunrise until long after dark. That was when the failures began. The first call came at 6:12 inches the morning. A starter motor had burned out on a 40-year-old tractor. The second call came before Walter finished writing down the model number. A hydraulic pump had lost pressure while lifting a grain wagon. By 8 o'clock, 3 more farmers had called about a broken PTO shaft, a leaking steering valve, and a transmission that refused to stay in gear. Daniel stood beside the telephone with a notebook. The dealership says 2 to 6 weeks on most of these. Walter looked outside at the stripped tractors. For a farmer in harvest, 6 weeks means next year. He unlocked the parts room. After Samuel Reed's gear failure, every usable component had been inspected again. The shelves were no longer full, but the parts that remained carried detailed tags. Source tractor, casting number, measurements, test results, known compatible models. Walter refused to call any part ready unless the record proved it. The first customer arrived before 7. Frank Willis backed a flatbed into the yard with an old green tractor chained behind his truck. The starter housing was black from heat, and the armature had burned through its insulation. "I need it tonight," Frank said. "The combine is filling wagons faster than my other tractor can move them." Walter checked the mounting pattern and drive gear. A starter from tractor number 3 shared the same housing, but the pinion gear had 1 fewer tooth. "Won't work," Daniel said. Walter moved to another shelf. The starter from tractor number 12 had the correct gear and voltage, but its mounting nose was different. Walter disassembled both units and compared the internal parts. The armature and field coils match. He said, "They rebuilt Frank's original housing using the tested internal assembly from number 12. Before installation, Daniel placed the starter on the load bench. It turned freely without resistance. Walter increased the load. The current draw remained within specification. Only then did they bolt it to the tractor. Frank left before noon. By that time, 2 more trucks were waiting outside. The next repair was more difficult. A dairy farmer named Louise Grant had lost hydraulic pressure on the tractor that powered her feed mixer. Without it, nearly 200 cattle would have to be fed by hand. Walter found a compatible pump body, but its pressure plate was worn. Daniel suggested using the plate from another unit. Walter measured it. Too thin. By 4 thousandths. That's enough to lose pressure when the oil gets hot. They searched 3 dismantled pumps before finding a usable plate. Walter rebuilt the assembly, then tested it first with cold oil and again at operating temperature. Louise watched the gauge climb. "Can I take it now?" "Not yet." The pump held pressure for 15 minutes. Walter checked the temperature around the front bearing and inspected the shaft seal. Only after the reading remained stable did he release it. By Wednesday, there were 11 trucks outside the gate. Some carried broken components in buckets. Others arrived with entire tractors. Farmers who had laughed at the auction now stood quietly beside the workbench, waiting for Walter to check casting numbers. Daniel created a list on the office wall. Emergency harvest failures came first. Machines with backups waited. Cosmetic problems were refused. Walter also limited each repair to the failed system. "We are not rebuilding entire tractors during harvest," he told one customer. "We are getting safe machines back into the field." The pace began to wear on him. His hands swelled from gripping tools. He stopped eating lunch. Twice, Daniel found him staring at a measurement he had already written down. "You need rest," Daniel said. Walter looked through the open doors. A line of wagons moved along the distant road, carrying grain toward the elevator. After harvest. That evening, a farmer arrived from North County with a broken transmission shaft. Walter recognized the part immediately. 3 local farms used the same design. He checked the shelf. Empty. Daniel searched the tagged inventory again. "There has to be another one." Walter walked into the yard and stopped between the remaining tractor frames. Under the fading light, 14 machines had become 9 incomplete shells. Somewhere among them might be the shaft they needed. But by the next morning, everyone in the county could need the same one. The broken shaft came from a farmer named Ben Carter. It drove the transmission's second and third gear cluster, carrying most of the load when a tractor pulled a full grain wagon. Without it, Ben's machine could still start, steer, and it simply could not work. Walter placed the 2 broken pieces together on the bench. The fracture had begun at the edge of a worn keyway, then spread across the shaft under repeated load. Daniel checked the casting and assembly records. Same transmission as the Miller farm tractors. And the Grant place, Walter said. 3 farms, 5. If the early models used the same diameter, Walter walked into the yard. Tractor number 5 still had its transmission, but rain had entered through an open shifter hole. When Daniel removed the cover, rusty water ran down the case. The shaft beneath it was deeply pitted. Rejected. Number 9 had supplied Samuel Reed's failed gear. Its matching shaft looked clean, but magnetic testing revealed a crack near the bearing shoulder. Rejected. They found the final candidate inside tractor number 13. Its gearbox had remained sealed. The oil smelled old but contained no water. Walter removed the shaft, cleaned it, and measured every bearing surface. The keyway showed little wear. The shaft was straight. It passed magnetic inspection. Then Walter mounted it in the load fixture. The metal held. Daniel attached a green tag. "Ready for service." Ben exhaled. "I'll take it." Before Walter could answer, another truck entered the yard. Then another. The first belonged to Carl Miller. His transmission had begun knocking while hauling corn. The second carried a mechanic from Westridge Farm, the largest operation in the county. Both needed the same shaft. Daniel looked at the single green tag. Carl stepped forward. "I called yesterday." Ben shook his head. "My tractor is already apart. The Westridge mechanic placed a purchase order on the bench. My boss will pay double. Cash, if necessary." Walter ignored the paper. "How many working tractors does Westridge have? That isn't the point. It is here." The mechanic's jaw tightened. 7. Walter looked at Carl. "Backup machine? 1. But the clutch slips. Can it pull an empty wagon? Probably." Then Walter turned to Ben. "Any other tractor?" Ben shook his head. "This is it. I've got 60 acres cut and grain sitting in wagons." Walter placed the shaft beside Ben's broken pieces. "It goes in his tractor." The West Ridge mechanic pushed the purchase order closer. "You're refusing double the money?" "I'm refusing to stop 7 tractors from becoming 8. Carl frowned. "So I get nothing? You get a temporary plan." Walter told him to use the backup tractor only for empty wagons and level ground. He would inspect the clutch that afternoon and determine whether it could safely finish harvest. Carl disliked the answer, but accepted it. The West Ridge mechanic did not. "This is bad business." Walter looked at the 3 men. During harvest, the first question isn't who pays most. What is it? Who stops working without the part? Daniel began installing the shaft in Ben's transmission. Walter checked the bearings, synchronizer, and gear teeth before allowing the case to close. 2 hours later, the tractor passed its first test. Walter made Ben drive it without a load. Then, with an empty wagon, after the oil reached operating temperature, they checked for noise, heat, and metal on the drain magnet. Only then did Walter release it. By evening, Carl's backup tractor was inside the shop. The clutch was worn, but adjustable. Daniel restored the correct free play, replaced a damaged linkage pin, and warned Carl not to pull full wagons uphill. It was not a complete repair. It was enough to keep grain moving. The next morning, Walter wrote a new rule on the wall. Limited parts are assigned by need, not price. Some customers respected it. Others accused him of choosing favorites. The complaints grew as more machines failed. One farmer offered triple for a hydraulic valve already promised to a smaller operation. Another demanded Walter remove a tested part from a tractor waiting for installation. Walter refused both. That night, Daniel found him alone beside the inventory shelves. "You know this could cost us customers." Walter stared at the empty space where the transmission shaft had been. "We can replace customers." Daniel waited. Walter closed the ledger. "We can't replace their harvest." Dale Mercer waited until the line outside Walter's shop became impossible to ignore. By Thursday morning, trucks stretched from the gate to the county road. Farmers stood beside broken pumps, cracked housings, and transmission parts wrapped in feed sacks. Some had driven more than 40 miles. Dale parked his black pickup across the road and watched for nearly 10 minutes. He did not come inside. That afternoon, a printed notice appeared on the counter of Mercer Equipment. Salvage parts may contain hidden cracks, metal fatigue, or unsafe modifications. The notice did not mention Walter by name. It did not need to. Copies appeared at the grain elevator, the feed store, and Miller's diner. Dale told customers that no responsible dealer could guarantee components removed from abandoned machinery. Some of what he said was true. Walter knew that better than anyone. He still kept Samuel Reed's broken gear on the highest shelf above the workbench. The dark fracture line through its hub was a reminder that clean metal could hide years of damage. By Friday, 3 customers had canceled. A fourth arrived only to ask for his deposit back. Daniel watched the man leave. "We should answer him." Walter continued measuring a hydraulic spool. He asked a question. "He accused us of selling dangerous parts. Then we show him what we sell." The next morning, Walter cleared the front wall of the shop. He hung inspection sheets beside every completed component. Each sheet listed the source machine, casting number, measurements, repairs, test pressure, operating temperature, and known limitations. Red-tagged parts remained visible in a locked scrap cage so customers could see what had been rejected. Daniel added copies of the magnetic particle and die test results. "If Dale wants to talk about hidden cracks," he said, "we'll show people how we find them." Walter nodded. "Without pretending we find everything." That distinction mattered. Every customer received the same explanation. Used parts carried history. Testing reduced risk. But no honest mechanic could promise that old metal would last forever. Walter guaranteed the inspection and workmanship. He did not guarantee time. Late that afternoon, Dale finally entered the shop. His polished boots stopped just inside the doorway. "You've built quite a crowd," he said. Walter closed the ledger. "What do you need?" "I'm here to make you an offer." Dale looked around at the tagged shelves and open notebooks. He offered to buy every tested component in the building, along with the remaining tractors outside. The price was higher than Walter had paid at auction and high enough to repair the roof, clear the bills, and leave money in the bank. Then Dale added the real condition. "I want your cross-reference notes." Daniel looked up sharply. Dale continued. "Casting numbers, compatible models, modification, all of it. You've done the difficult part. I can put these through a proper business." Walter studied him. "And the customers? They come through my dealership." "At your prices?" "At market prices." Walter knew what that meant. The parts would disappear behind a service counter. Farmers would no longer see the measurements, test failures, or alternatives. Dale would sell the knowledge as scarcity. Walter pushed the offer back. No. Dale's smile faded. You're tired. Your hands are failing. You can't serve half the county from this building. That doesn't make the notes yours. Dale stepped closer. When one of these parts fails, they won't blame the tractor. They'll blame you. Walter glanced at Samuel's broken gear. They should. Dale had no answer to that. Before he left, a truck entered the yard at high speed. Thomas Bell jumped out before the engine stopped. His family operated the largest independent grain farm in the county. Behind him, chained to a lowboy, sat their only heavy tractor capable of pulling the harvest trailers from the western fields. Oil covered the transmission housing. A crack ran from the bearing seat toward the lower mounting flange. Thomas placed both hands on Walter's bench. The dealer says there isn't another housing in the state. Dale stood near the doorway. Walter looked at him. Dale said nothing. Thomas's voice tightened. The storm reaches us tomorrow night. Walter walked to the tractor and examined the crack. Then he turned toward the 14 machines in the yard. Only one remaining transmission had a housing close enough to matter. Its casting number was different. Thomas Bell's tractor filled nearly the entire center bay. It was the largest machine Walter had accepted that season. Built to pull loaded grain trailers from fields too soft for smaller tractors. Without it, the Bell family could still harvest. They could not move the grain. Walter cleaned the cracked transmission housing with solvent. The fracture began beside the rear bearing seat, crossed an oil passage, and ended near the lower mounting flange. Welding it would distort the bore that held the main shaft. Thomas watched from the doorway. Can it be repaired? Not before the storm. Daniel checked the parts records. Number 14 has a similar housing. Similar isn't enough, Walter said. They walked outside. Tractor number 14 sat near the fence with weeds around its rear wheels. Its engine had seized years earlier, but the transmission remained sealed. Walter scraped the casting number clean. It did not match the Bell tractor. Daniel opened the reference notebook. Different manufacturer. Different name. Walter said, maybe not a different design. Removing the housing took nearly 2 hours. The bolts were rusted. One snapped below the surface and had to be drilled out. When they finally separated the case, the gears inside were coated with clean oil. Walter inspected the housing for cracks, then placed it beside the Bell casting. At first glance, the two parts appeared nearly identical. The mounting holes aligned. The shaft centers matched. The bearing diameter was correct. But the oil passages were different. The salvage housing fed the rear bearing through a channel on the left side. The Bell tractor used a passage from above, installed without modification. The shaft would run dry under load. Thomas looked toward the western sky. We have 26 hours. Walter measured both passages again. Then we don't waste one. He and Daniel removed the bearing retainer from the damaged housing. It contained the original oil channel and could be transferred, but one shoulder on the salvage casting was too wide by 32 thousandths of an inch. Daniel studied the difference. We machine the shoulder, and if we cut too deep, the bearing moves. And then, the gears lose alignment. Walter handed him the measuring tools. Set up the mill. Daniel worked slowly. He removed only a few thousandths with each pass, stopping to measure the shoulder and test the retainer. Thomas paced outside while the Bell family called for updates. Near midnight, the retainer seated correctly. The main shaft turned by hand. But Walter was not satisfied. They installed temporary bearings, assembled the gear cluster, and coated the teeth with marking compound. Daniel rotated the transmission under resistance. The contact pattern appeared too close to one edge. Misalignment, Daniel said. Walter checked the housing again. The casting was correct. The transferred retainer was correct. Then he found the problem. A thin factory shim had remained stuck to the damaged housing. Without it, The shaft sat 6/1000ths too far forward. Daniel installed the shim and repeated the test. This time, the contact pattern centered across the gear teeth. At 3 in the morning, they completed the assembly. Walter filled the case with oil and connected the tractor to the test brake. He ran each gear without load, then increased resistance gradually. The housing remained quiet. Oil pressure reached the rear bearing. No leaks appeared around the modified retainer. Thomas stood beside the clock. "Can we take it?" "Not yet." Walter held the tractor under working load until the transmission reached operating temperature. Daniel checked the bearing area with a temperature gauge every 5 minutes. The reading rose, then stabilized. At sunrise, Walter shut down the engine and removed the drain magnet. No metal. No fragments. No warning signs. Thomas climbed into the cab. Walter stopped him. "First trip with an empty trailer. Come back after 1 hour. We don't have time." "You have less time if it fails in the field." Thomas stared at him, then nodded. The tractor returned 58 minutes later. The housing was warm but not overheating. The oil level had not dropped. Walter inspected every bolt and fitting once more. Then he stepped away. "Take it." Thomas drove toward the western fields as dark clouds formed along the horizon. Behind him, the largest harvest in the county was waiting on one housing, taken from a tractor everyone had called junk. The Bell tractor entered the western field at 7:14 inches the morning. Thomas drove it slowly at first, pulling an empty trailer across the rough ground while his brother followed in a pickup. After the first mile, they stopped and checked the transmission housing. No leak. No unusual heat. No change in the sound of the gears. Thomas called Walter from the field. "It's holding. Check it again after the first loaded run." Walter said, "We've got grain standing and rain coming. That doesn't change the metal." Thomas ended the call without arguing. By 9 o'clock, the first trailer returned loaded. Daniel was waiting beside the shop with the temperature gauge. The reading near the rear bearing was higher than before, but still within the limit Walter had written in the ledger. Walter crawled beneath the tractor and inspected the modified retainer. The bolts were tight. The oil remained clean. "Send it back," he said. The tractor worked without stopping for the next 4 hours. The Bell combine cut row after row while the repaired machine carried grain toward the storage barns. Smaller tractors moved the lighter wagons, but only Thomas's machine could handle the heavy trailers from the low western fields. By noon, the storm clouds had grown darker. The radio warned of strong wind and heavy rain by midnight. The Bells still had more than 100 acres standing. Walter and Daniel drove to the farm with tools, oil, spare seals, and the inspection ledger. They set up beneath an equipment shed near the field entrance. Every third trip, Thomas stopped. Daniel checked the housing temperature. Walter checked the oil level and listened to the transmission through a steel rod pressed against the case. The repaired housing remained stable. At 3 in the afternoon, the grain elevator announced it would close early because of the storm. That created a second problem. The Bell family could harvest the grain, but they no longer had enough covered storage. Then the first unexpected truck arrived. It belonged to Earl Dawson. He brought an empty grain wagon. Behind him came Harold Pike with another. Both men had heard about the failed tractor and the approaching rain. "We've got room in our north barn," Earl said. "You fill the wagons? We'll move them." More farmers followed. Some were customers Walter had helped during the week. Others had laughed when the 14 tractors first appeared in his yard. No one mentioned that now. Frank Willis brought diesel fuel. Louise Grant brought food and coffee. Carl Miller arrived with the backup tractor. Walter had adjusted and began pulling empty wagons across level ground, exactly as instructed. By late afternoon, the Bell farm had become a coordinated line of machines. One tractor carried grain from the combine. Another moved it to temporary storage. Pickups transported fuel and tools. Men directed wagons through the narrow barn entrances. Walter remained beside the repaired machine. A chase patruzech. Daniel noticed the temperature climbing faster than before. 10 degrees in one trip. Walter touched the housing. Load was heavier. Could be the bearing? They stopped the tractor immediately. Thomas climbed down. We're losing daylight. Walter drained a small sample of oil into a clean pan. No metal appeared. Daniel checked the brakes and found the right trailer brake dragging. The extra resistance had forced the transmission to work harder. They disconnected the faulty trailer and replaced it with Earl's wagon. On the next run, the temperature returned to normal. Thomas looked at Walter. You stopped the whole operation for a trailer brake. I stopped it before you blamed the transmission. At sunset, 38 acres remained. The western sky flashed with distant lightning. The work lights came on. The repaired tractor continued through darkness, its headlights cutting through dust while the combine emptied into the trailers. Adun sprezece, opt sprezece. The first drops struck the shed roof. One final wagon remained in the field. Thomas drove the tractor toward it, while wind bent the dry stalks nearly flat. The rain increased before he reached the barn. Walter stood beneath the doorway, watching the headlights approach through the storm. The tractor crossed the yard, pulling the last load. As soon as the wagon entered the barn, the rain became a solid wall. Thomas shut down the engine. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Earl looked at the wet yard and laughed. 14 junk tractors, he said. Walter placed one hand on the warm transmission housing. Only a small part of tractor, number 14, had reached the field. But that part had carried the harvest home. The rain lasted 2 days. By the time the roads dried, every farmer in the county had heard what happened at the Bell farm. They heard that a transmission housing taken from one of Walter's junk tractors had survived 18 hours under load. They heard that the final wagon reached the barn just before the storm. They heard that Walter stopped the tractor 3 times to inspect it. Even with the harvest running out of time, what they remembered most was that it held. On Monday morning, Walter arrived at the shop before sunrise. 6 trucks were already waiting outside the gate. By 7, there were 14. Some carried broken parts in wooden boxes. Others hauled entire tractors. One farmer had driven nearly 70 miles with a steering pump wrapped in a grain sack. Daniel unlocked the gate. The vehicles began rolling in. Walter stood beside the office door and watched the yard fill. A month earlier, people had slowed down to laugh at the rusted tractors lined along the fence. Now those same people searched the stripped frames for casting numbers. The first man in line was Roy Tanner, who had helped Walter haul the tractors from the auction yard. Roy placed a cracked differential cover on the bench. Think there's anything left out there that fits this? Walter examined the bolt pattern. Maybe. Roy looked through the open door. I should have asked that before I called them scrap. Walter said nothing. He had no interest in collecting apologies. He needed information. What model, what year, what load was it carrying when it failed? Daniel began writing the answers in the job ledger. The new system was strict. Every repair received a number. Every part was traced to its source machine. Every customer was told what had been tested, what had been modified, and what remained uncertain. Walter refused work that did not have a clear purpose. One farmer left a tractor in the yard with a note taped to the steering wheel. Make it good again. Daniel read it aloud. Walter removed the note. Call him. What do I ask? What does he need the tractor to do? The owner returned that afternoon. He wanted the machine to pull a feed wagon and operate a small loader. He did not need a full restoration. He did not need new paint. He did not need every gauge working. Walter reduced the job to the systems that mattered. Brakes, steering, hydraulics, cooling, and safe low-speed pulling. The estimate became affordable. The work became possible. As the week continued, the shop changed. Farmers no longer asked whether Walter could make an old tractor look new. They asked which parts were still worth saving. Daniel handled routine inspections without waiting for instructions. He measured shafts, recorded clearances, checked pressure loss with hot oil, and rejected parts that failed. Walter reviewed the safety-critical work. He no longer touched every bolt. That was harder for him than any repair. On Thursday, Daniel rebuilt a hydraulic control valve for a farmer from Mason County. The replacement spool came from tractor number 7. The spring came from number 11. The original body was reused after passing pressure and crack tests. Walter watched from across the shop. Daniel completed the assembly and placed it on the test stand. The valve held cold pressure. Then Daniel heated the oil. At operating temperature, the gauge fell. Not far, but enough. Daniel shut down the stand. The farmer frowned. It's almost holding. Daniel removed the green tag. Almost isn't a test result. Walter looked down so no one would see him smile. The valve needed another 2 hours of work and a different seal set. The farmer waited. When the second test passed, Daniel signed the inspection sheet beneath Walter's name. That evening, the last customer left after sunset. The yard was quiet again. Only 5 of the 14 tractors still resembled complete machines. The others had become empty frames, bare axles, and carefully labeled spaces on the shelves. Daniel stood beside the inventory board. We need more room. Walter looked around the shop. Engines occupied the center aisle. Shelves reached the ceiling. Finished parts waited beside inspection records. 3 tractors were scheduled for collection the next morning. We need another building, Daniel said. Walter shook his head. We need another mechanic. Daniel leaned against the bench. Someone experienced? No. Walter opened the old notebook containing 40 years of measurements and cross-references. Someone willing to learn why a part fits before being told that it does. Outside the gate, headlights appeared on the road. Another truck slowed and turned toward the shop. The line was already beginning again. The town meeting was held 3 weeks after harvest. Walter had no intention of attending. He was replacing a worn steering shaft when Daniel entered the shop, wearing a clean shirt and carrying Walter's jacket. You're going? Walter kept working. I have work. You have a chair waiting at the community hall. That sounds like their problem. Daniel placed the jacket over the workbench. The bells asked for you. So did Earl. Walter looked at the steering shaft. It could wait. The community hall was already full when they arrived. Farmers stood along the walls. Families filled the folding chairs. Near the front sat Thomas Bell, Earl Dawson, Harold Pike, and several people who had once gathered at Miller's Diner to laugh about 14 ruined tractors. Dale Mercer stood near the back. The county agricultural board began with harvest figures. Despite the storm, local crop losses had been lower than expected. Shared wagons, borrowed tractors, temporary storage, and emergency repairs had kept grain moving. Then Thomas Bell stepped to the microphone. He described the western field, the cracked transmission housing, and the final wagon entering the barn as rain covered the yard. That tractor didn't save the harvest by itself, he said. People did. But without Walter finding that housing, we wouldn't have had enough time for people to help. Applause filled the room. Walter remained seated. Earl spoke next. He reminded everyone about the auction. We saw 14 tractors that would never run again, he said. Walter saw pumps, gears, shafts, valves, and housings that could keep other machines alive. Someone laughed softly. This time, Walter heard no cruelty in it. The board presented him with a wooden plaque recognizing his service during harvest. Walter accepted it because refusing would have embarrassed Daniel. When he reached the microphone, the room became quiet. He looked at the plaque. Then, at the farmers in front of him, "You weren't wrong about those tractors," he said. Several people shifted in their seats. They were broken. Most of them were beyond repair. Some of the parts were dangerous. We rejected almost as much as we saved. He glanced toward Samuel Reed, who stood near the side wall. One part failed because I trusted what I could see instead of proving what the metal could hold. That mistake changed how we worked. Walter placed the plaque on the table. The lesson isn't that every old machine is valuable. Most aren't not as complete machines. He paused. The lesson is that broken and worthless are not the same thing. No one moved. A seized engine can still protect a good pump. A cracked transmission can still contain usable shafts. A tractor with no future of its own may keep 5 others working. Walter looked at Daniel, but only if someone knows how to inspect it, measure it, test it, and reject it when it fails. The applause began slowly, then spread through the hall. After the meeting, Dale approached him near the exit. "I heard you're expanding," he said. "We're reorganizing. I'll improve my offer." Walter waited. Dale offered to buy the remaining inventory, the notebooks, and the compatibility records. He also offered Daniel a position at the dealership. "You've proved the idea," Dale said. "Now let someone with capital scale it." Daniel looked at his father. Walter looked at Dale. "You still think the tractors were the valuable part?" Dale frowned. "Aren't they? The parts run out." Walter tapped the notebook beneath Daniel's arm. "This doesn't, if it's taught properly." They left Dale standing in the hallway. The following Monday, a 17-year-old named Noah Briggs arrived at the shop. He had repaired lawnmowers, changed oil, and once installed a clutch backward. He knew almost nothing about tractors. Walter handed him a cracked hydraulic housing. "Tell me whether it's usable." Noah turned it over. "It looks fine." Walter placed a die testing kit on the bench. "Looking is where we start." Daniel opened a fresh ledger. Outside, the auction tractors stood in various states of disassembly. Some had lost engines. Others were only frames resting on blocks. None would ever return to a field as complete machines. But parts from them were already working across 4 counties. Walter had bought 14 tractors the town believed were finished. By the end of harvest, pieces of them were still moving grain.